little bit of time.
We had to drive the dirt road to get to the car. We didn't want to look at it.
I got a few more coming in. I'll give them a minute.
Yeah, you can relate on What's the big deal about that?
I was going to say, there's a few more. It's springing in. Get a stick after them. Oh, yeah. I love it. I love it. All righty. Well, good morning, everybody. It is definitely glad to be back. We have missed y'all's faces and missed being here, so we are definitely glad to be back with y'all and be able to teach and worship a little bit with people we've only known for a little bit, but still feel like family. So in class and in preaching a little bit in Colorado, we've been doing some studies through the book of Joshua, so we're going to be in Joshua 11 today. That may be an odd place to start, but since I can't be here long enough to teach you through the entire book, we'll just pick a spot and camp out a little bit. To give you a kind of recap of the beginning of Joshua and the end of Deuteronomy, we've had the Israelites that have come out of captivity and they've wandered through the wilderness for 40 years. And then, of course, you've had Caleb and the spies sent in and they've gone and spied out the land. And in the beginnings of Joshua and over in chapter 10 and beforehand, you've had the southern conquest and you've had Jericho and Ai that have been taken. Then you've had the whole southern land. Well, chapter 11 is about the northern conquest. Well, that's where we're going to be at today. So for this study, we're going to kind of have a main idea that we're going to kind of think about while we go throughout the study. And all throughout the book of Joshua, one of the main things, and even all through Deuteronomy, if you can sum it up into one command, that's one word, the word is obey. For all through Deuteronomy, here's the laws, this is what you do, you need to obey them, you need to obey what God has commanded, obey what God has told Moses to tell the people. And even through Joshua, that idea is still the same. So if you want to title this chapter, it's Total Obedience Leads to Total Victory. And that's going to kind of be our theme that we go through. And we're going to bounce around just a little bit, but chapter 11 is where we're going to camp out. So as we said, we've got the conquest that was in the south, and we had the issues with Achan and his sin when he took something that God said he wasn't supposed to take, and they had their issue when they tried to take Ai, and then they got that all fixed up. And something that was very interesting, after Achan had sinned and they couldn't take Ai and they had that mishap, and back in a few chapters, as soon as that was fixed and that sin was done with, the very next verse, and God went to fight for them. God was that quick, and here's the sin, here's how you fix it. So Joshua, that's exactly what he did. This is what God said is sin, we need to fix it. And the very next verse, God didn't say, well, you kind of made me mad, so I'm going to hang out and you are going to kind of do your own thing for a little while. That's not. As soon as they fixed the sin in the camp, God was with them. And so we're going to start in Joshua 11, and we're just going to read through it. I think it's a good idea to read through the whole thing to get an understanding, and then we'll go back and break it down. So we'll read through it in Joshua chapter 11. It says, Then it came about when Jabin, the king of Hatzor, heard of it, he sent to Jobab, the king of Madon, and the king of Shimron, and the king of Achshvash, and the kings that were in the north and the hill country, and in the Arabah, and the south, the Chinnerot, and in the lowland, and on the heights of Dor of the west, to the Canaanite on the east and on the west, and the Amorite, and the Hittite, and the Perizzite, and Jebushite, and the hill country, and the Hivite at the foot of Hermon in the land of Mizpah. And they came out, they and all of their armies with them, as many as the people as the sand that is on the seashore, with very many horses and chariots. So all of these things, kings having agreed to meet, came and encamped together at the waters of Merom to fight against Israel. And the Lord said to Joshua, Do not be afraid because of them, for tomorrow at this time I will deliver all of them slain before Israel. You shall hamstring their horses and burn their chariots with fire. And so Joshua and all the people of war with him came upon them suddenly by the waters of Merom, and they attacked them. And the Lord delivered them into the hands of Israel, so that they defeated them, and they pursued them as far as the great Sidon, and Mirispoth-Maim, and the valley of Mizpah to the east, and they struck them with no survivor was left to them. Joshua did to them as the Lord had told him. He hamstrung their horses and burned their chariots with fire. And then Joshua turned back at that time and captured Hatzor and struck its king with the sword, for Hatzor formerly was the head of all of these kingdoms. They struck every person who was in it with the edge of the sword, utterly destroying them, that there was no one left who breathed. And he burned Hatzor with fire, and Joshua captured all of these cities, of these kings, and all of their kings, and he struck them with the edge of the sword and utterly destroyed them, just as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded. However, Israel did not burn any cities that stood on their mounds, except Hatzor alone, which Joshua burned. all the spoils of these cities and the cattle and the sons of Israel took as their plunder, but they struck every man with the edge of the sword until they had destroyed them. They left no one who breathed. Just as the Lord had commanded Moses his servant, so Moses commanded Joshua, and so Joshua did. He left nothing undone of all that the Lord had commanded Moses. Thus Joshua took all of that land, the hill country, and all of the Negev, all of the land of Goshen, the lowland, the Arabah, the hill country of Israel, and its lowland, from Mount Halak that rises toward Seir, even as far as Baal Gad in the valley of Lebanon, at the foot of Mount Hermon. And he captured all of their kings and struck them down and put them to death. So Joshua waged war a long time with all of these kings, and there was not a city which made peace with the sons of Israel, except the Hivites living in Gibeon. They took them all in battle. For it was of the Lord to harden their hearts to meet Israel in battle, in order that they might utterly destroy them, that they might receive no mercy, but that he might destroy them, just as the Lord had commanded Moses. Then Joshua came at that time and cut off the Anakim from the hill country, from Hebron, and from Debir, and from Anab, and from the hill country of Judah, and from all the hill country of Israel. Joshua utterly destroyed them with their cities. There was no Anakim left in the land of the sons of Israel, only in Gaza and Gat and Ashdod remained. So Joshua took the whole land according to all the Lord had spoken to Moses. And Joshua gave it for an inheritance to Israel, according to their division by their tribes. Thus the land had rest from war. So one thing we can talk about in Joshua is a recurring theme over and over again is there was a person or a king or a group of people, and they heard what was going on with the Israelites and what God was doing through Joshua, and how they responded greatly affected a lot of times their survival. We see that the Gibeonites, back in a few chapters before, they had come to the Israelites and they had deceived them and dressed up as if they were a faraway people, and look, our shoes are worn out, and here's all the stuff that we don't have, and our bread is crumbling, because they knew they weren't to make peace and treaties with these people that were in the land that God was going to give to them. But, however, they deceived them, and of course, if you don't ask God how to go for guidance and what they should do, they were in a covenant that they shouldn't have been in, but they honored it. So that was the only people that made peace with Israel out of all of these kingdoms. But in verse 1, we'll go through and break it down. Then it came about when Jabin, the king of Hatzor, heard of it, that he sent to Jobab, king of Madon, and these other kings. So what was it that he heard that was going on? Well, he heard of the conquest. He heard of the southern land of Israel being taken, or by the Israelites being taken, and the wars, and these kings being destroyed, and these kingdoms being devoted to utter destruction. They had heard all of these things going on. And how did he respond? Did it say, well, we'll go to them and we understand that God is the one true God and we'll bow down and worship Him and give our life as service to Israel? That's not what they did. It happened when he heard that he sent to these other kings. And all of these other kings it lists, verse 1 and 2 and 3, and he gathered up a group of people, all of these other people. He responded and they unified against Israel. They probably felt pretty good about the army they had, because it says how many people were there. Let's see, in verse 4. As many as the sand on the seashore. I can just imagine how big of a group of people that is. If you go out on the sea and you try to count pieces of sand, that's a lot of people. What else did they have that Israel did not? And they came out, verse 4, they and all of their armies with them, as many people as the sand is on the seashore, with very many horses and chariots. And I thought it was pretty interesting and pretty comical, but there was one commentator on this section, and he said horses and chariots to those people was the equivalent of tanks in our time. They had artillery, they had manpower, they had horses and chariots, and Israel didn't have that. So they seemed, I could almost see Israel going out their front door, and you've got as many people as the sand on the seashore, and they're not here for Sunday afternoon potluck. They're not here to be friends. They're not here to play games, and they've got their artillery and their tanks on the front line, and, well, we're here. We've heard about what's going on, and we're here to deal with business. As many people as the sand is on the seashore. So all the kings, in verse 5, agreed to meet, and they came and they encamped together at the waters of Merom for one reason. They didn't come to make peace. They didn't come to make treaties. They didn't come to talk it out. To fight against Israel. That was their sole purpose, was to fight against Israel. Then the Lord said to Joshua, do not be afraid. Why was Joshua not to be afraid? God was with them. And that is something that you see over and over and over again in Joshua. If God is for us, then who can be against us? Over and over again, those people You can have all the tanks and artillery in the world and all of the men and the strongest fighters and warriors, but if you don't have God, what is that worth? Absolutely nothing. It does you no good. So, as we see, he said, don't be afraid of them, for tomorrow at this time I will give all of them over, slain before Israel. You shall hamstring their horses and burn their chariots with fire. So when Joshua, when he's going through this conquest and these fights and these battles, where did he get his information of how to behave and how to go in these battles? Did he have the Art of War textbook and he have a manual to how to fight wars and he was just looking up stuff? Where did he get his information? God. Think that may have had something to do with his success? He got his information straight from the man who's best known to how to handle things. And how did it say they were going to give all these people over to Joshua? Did it say they were going to give them over as slaves? Nope. Slain. A body without a soul, a dead person. They were going to give them over. And something we can point out, as we've seen a few times, in 4, 5, 6, and verse 7, the word all in different various forms has come up 4 times already. So in just Joshua chapter 11 alone, this word all, this key word, if you mark your keyword, your Bibles any, this word is going to come up 24 times just in chapter 11 alone. Yes, ma'am.
In Psalms 20,
Yep.
it says, "Some trust in chariots and some in the horses, but we trust in the name of our Lord our God."
Absolutely. You think those warriors trusted in their horses and their chariots? We're the only ones that got them. They don't have them, so why in the world would we even think about it? We've got this one little group, and we've got nations and nations and nations, and now we've got tanks and armies, and why do we need to trust God? We don't even know their God. Why would we worry about that? They may have took care of the southern kingdom, but that was just a few kings. But like you said, we don't trust in horses and chariots. So Joshua got his information. Now, if Joshua had got his information on what to do and he disobeyed, how would the rest of this chapter have turned out? Completely different. So here we see our theme again of total obedience leads to total victory. Not partial, not 90%, but total obedience. And like the word all, that key word that we're talking about, that complete, that whole, that every person, that whole all obedience. The word all comes up in the book of Joshua 240 times. That's quite a bit. So as we can see, that's definitely a key word that goes on through here. Why were they to hamstring their horses and burn their chariots? That seems pretty odd when you just think of it. That's why?
Destroy the mobility.
Destroy the mobility. Because if you use modern wisdom, if you went to how maybe the United States would look at it, if you've defeated your enemy or you got them and they have all of this artillery and machinery and stuff, why wouldn't you use it? Why wouldn't you keep it? They couldn't. That's not what... They could. However... And not trusting in the horses and chariots.
Didn't they not have horses and chariots because Egypt had them?
Yep. So if you'll look in, let's flip back. Deuteronomy 17, verse 16. So there's lots of laws and commands given in Deuteronomy. And then let's back up in 17 verse 16. Moreover, he shall not multiply horses for himself, nor shall he cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses, since the Lord has said to you, you shall never again return that way. So if they didn't have horses and chariots and they wanted to get them, where would they go? They would go to Egypt. You study anything about Egyptian culture and history, they were the capital of breeding and training and sending out and selling war horses in that time. So that would most likely be where they would have to go to get them. And they were told, you are not to go back there. You shall never again return. So they weren't to multiply horses. They weren't to go to Egypt. So they hamstrung these horses. And then right after that, God told them, this is what you do. And verse 7. Does it say Joshua debated and talked to his people and let's make sure, are we really going to trust God in this instance? Are we sure about that God's got it all right and got all the facts together? Yes, sir. So when you hamstring a war horse, you take their back tendons and cut them. And there was even some that said they could probably still be used for farm work because you wouldn't completely lame them, but as far as pulling chariots and doing harsh work and going to war like that, they would be completely worthless. Yep. But yep, so they were made completely useless as far as using for war purposes. The text doesn't say they used them for farmland, but that was one commentator said they possibly could have been. And but yep, they hamstrung them, so they were useless in war. But verse 7, God gave this command, and God told Joshua, and then the very next verse, so Joshua. God commanded, and once again, as you can see all throughout the book of Joshua, if God told Joshua to do something, He did it. So Joshua and all, there's our word again, the people of war with him, came upon them suddenly by the waters of Merom, and they fell upon them. It doesn't say they waited on the larger army to attack and then God was going to demonstrate His power. God gave a command and Joshua did it. We have the blessing of God. God told us what to do, and we're going to be the ones to go first because we've got God on our side. God had already promised a victory. They didn't have a reason to hesitate. If God said, when you fight these people, you're going to win. I'm going to make sure of it. You're going to go through and you're going to completely lay waste to their armies. Why would you wait? You've got God's blessing. You've got the green light. Go. And so they did. And the Lord gave them into the hand of Israel. So they struck them down and they pursued them as far as the great Sidon and both Maim and the valley of Mizpah to the east. And they struck them until there was no survivor remaining. Total obedience leads to total victory. He did it. Just as God promised, Israel did. Joshua did. So as far as human wisdom, when we talked about human battle tactics, does this make sense at all from a human perspective? Not at all. If you were a smaller army and you knew you couldn't be beat, a lot of times you go and you try the diplomatic approach and you try to make peace and, well, we know we can't beat you, so we're going to be your friend so you're not angry at us. That's not what they did. If you're just looking at this from purely human perspective, it makes no sense. It makes no sense because you're using man's wisdom. They were led by God's wisdom, which oftentimes it doesn't make sense to man because God knows all, God sees all. He's got everything, the playbook front to back already written that He can see. Man does not. So God promised them victory, and there was total victory. Verse 9, and Joshua did to them just as the Lord had said to him. He hamstrung their horses, and he burned their chariots with fire. They didn't need horses and chariots. They didn't need that heavy artillery. What good was it if you've already got the grace of God, if you've already got the power of God, if you've already got the will of God? Why do you need chariots and horses? Yes, ma'am.
You know what, Saul, I referred to Solomon,
Mm-hmm.
who was wise, but he wasn't obedient.
Mm-hmm.
He got his first wife from Egypt,
Mm-hmm.
and then in chapter 10, he went and got a bunch of horses from Egypt. So you can have knowledge, but not the wisdom of God.
Yep. And with all that knowledge and no obedience, how much is it worth? Zero. Nothing. If God had said, here's how you're going to win this war, and here's what you're going to do to their artillery, and I'm going to bless you, and they're like, yeah, but we don't really want to. That's kind of a big army, and they've got a lot, so we're kind of scared, so I think we'll pass, and we're not going to do that. God wouldn't save them. That would have been an utter disaster. Total obedience leads to total victory. Then Joshua turned back at that time in verse 10 and captured Hatzor and struck its king with the sword, for Hatzor had formerly was the head of all these kingdoms, and they struck every person who was in it with the edge of the sword, devoting them to destruction, and there was no one left who breathed, and he burned Hatzor with fire. And Joshua captured all the cities of these kings and all their kings, and he struck them with the edge of the sword, and he devoted them to destruction, just as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded. So Joshua, we see over and over times, and this is getting into the sermon a little bit, but it'll also come from Joshua chapter 11. It's about leadership. It's about what leaders are supposed to do, how leaders are supposed to act to be faithful leaders. If Moses, since it brought up, just as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded. So for Joshua to know the things, to know the will of God, of what he was to do, he got information from Moses, because Moses was a faithful leader. This is what God wants, and this is going to be God's man after I'm gone. So he was diligent. If you're a leader, and you know you're not going to be a leader, change of position, maybe getting older, whatever, what is your duty as a leader of God to make sure that you have when you step down and you step out of place? Or in Moses' instance, he passed away. A successor. Because if a leader doesn't have a successor and make sure that there's somebody who knows the will of God, who knows the Word of God, and who's willing to do that, what's going to happen to the people? Every which way. They're going to be sheep without a shepherd. They're not going to have a purpose or a goal. Or yes, sir.
And Moses was also a good delegator.
Absolutely.
Which is a sign of good leader.
Absolutely. And Moses made sure that Joshua knew what the Lord wanted. However, he burned Hatzor with fire, which was the main head of all of these kingdoms. However, 13, Israel did not burn any cities that stood on their mounds except Hatzor alone, which Joshua burned. And we're going to be doing a lot of bouncing back to Deuteronomy, but if you want to flip back to Deuteronomy 6, verse 10. So verse 10 says, Then it shall come about when the Lord your God brings you into the land which he swore to your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give to you great and splendid cities which you did not build, and continuing, and houses full of all good things which you did not fill, and hewn cisterns which you did not dig, vineyards and olive trees which you did not plant, and you eat and are satisfied. Why didn't they burn all of these cities? They were told not to. Can you imagine if Joshua was a leader and he kind of got in his head, look what we've done to Hatzor, the main kingdom, we've showed God's power and we burned it to the ground. And he got on a little bit of a high horse and he went and he destroyed everything else in all of the cities and burned the vineyards just to show that our God is a mighty God. And he forgot what God said.
You know, in reading this, I think about this. Joshua was definitely a good leader, but I believe God probably was a little bit more behind the scenes. Because think about this for a minute. He had a very small army in comparison.
Mm-hmm.
You would think these men would go, wait a minute, Joshua, you've lost your mind.
Yes.
We're not going to follow you because you're leading us to destruction.
Yep.
But they had faith in what Joshua said God told them to do.
Absolutely.
So that was a little more behind the scenes
Yep.
rather than just follow him blindly, I'll bet.
Yep.
You know.
And if they burned all of these places, when they got done with the conquest and they took the land, where are they going to live? What food are they going to eat? Where are they going to raise their families?
If they did burn it, then God would have just said, hey, you burned all of what you needed to have.
Absolutely. Everything that I've promised you of the houses you're going to live in that you didn't build, of the food you're going to partake that you didn't grow, they wouldn't have that. But God promised them that. How long from Deuteronomy 6 of this promise to Joshua chapter 11, do you think it was the next day that God promised this and they got what God promised? No. That was a long time. Not even the same generation of people. That was a long time to wait on a promise. I know when somebody makes me a promise, if it's been 2 or 3 days and I ain't seen them, hey, I've done what I've told you I'm going to do, and you get just checking to see how your promise is coming and see if you've made good on your word. This was a long time they had to wait on this promise. Verse 14, back in Joshua 11, Now all the spoils of these cities and the cattle and the sons of Israel took as their plunder. But they struck every man with the edge of the sword until they had destroyed them. They left no one remaining who breathed. They did just as God said. They devoted them to destruction. Verse 15, Just as the Lord had commanded Moses, his servant, so Moses commanded Joshua. And so Joshua did, and he left nothing undone, all that God, the Lord, had commanded Moses. So for our sermon, that's the key verse we're going to hover around is verse 15. Just as the Lord commanded Moses, his servant, so Moses commanded Joshua, and Joshua did. And what did he do? Did it say he done some of what God had commanded? Everything. He left nothing undone of all that the Lord had commanded Moses. Joshua fixed all of the issues when sin came up, and he completed and had complete obedience to the Word of God. A faithful leader must be obedient to the Word of God. And it doesn't say he gave partial or he gave 90%. He done it all. Verse 16, Thus Joshua took all of that land, not just a little bit, all of it. The hill country and all, and the Negev, all of the land of Goshen, and the Shephelah, and the Arabah, and the hill country of Israel, and its Shephelah. Total obedience leads to total victory. It doesn't say God promised and God only delivered a little bit. It doesn't say he got a little bit of the land because he was faithful to God. God promised him all of it, and guess what he got? He got all of it. Verse 17, even from Mount Halak that rises towards Seir, even from Baal Gad in the valley of Lebanon, at the foot of Mount Hermon, that's the Golan Heights today, and he captured all of their kings, and he struck them down and put them to death. Verse 18, and Joshua waged war a long time with all of these kings. So from the past and the earlier sections of Joshua, it seems that when God took him into battle, battle was done that day or a couple of days, and it was a very short amount of time, and it was, how long did this battle last? It says it waged war a long time with all of these kings. It wasn't, God said, I'm going to deliver them, and it's going to be tomorrow. Once again, we see when God makes a promise, who's God's timeline? What time is he running on? He's running on God's time. How many times do we look at God's plan and say, well, it hasn't happened the way I wanted it to or when I wanted it to? We live in Colorado and we get pretty spoiled when we order something from Amazon. Sometimes you can even get it delivered that day. Did they get the promise of their deliverance that day? It said they waged war a long time. So this is pretty interesting. There's a way you can get a rough estimate of how long that this war lasted. So Caleb, when he went in to spy at the beginning of all of this conquest, says he was about 40 years old. And then they wandered in the wilderness about 40 years, so he would have been 80 when all of this started, this conquest of the section. If you go on in the further chapters, it says that when he received his inheritance, at the end of all this conquest, at the end of the battles when the land was taken, it says he was 85. So if the conquest started at 80, and they wandered for maybe 39, 40 years, you're looking at anywhere from 5 to 7 years that this waged war a long time. I don't know about you, but I think after the first year, if God had promised me we're going to win, and it's been a year, and we're still fighting, I think there's a tendency to, did we do everything right? Is God really going to deliver on his promises? But what are we trying to do? We're trying to put God on man's timeline. God doesn't function that way. So if you've got 5 to 7 years of war, and they went on, they kept going. Verse 19, there was not a city which made peace with the sons of Israel except the Hivites living in Gibeon. Those are the Gibeonites back in further chapters that deceived them. And they took them all in battle. For it was of the Lord to strengthen their hearts to meet Israel in battle in order that they might devote them to destruction, that they might receive no mercy, but that he might destroy them just as the Lord had commanded Moses. They strengthened their hearts to go into battle. These enemies, they thought, we've got this massive army, we've got horses and chariots. I could just see them kind of puffing their chest out. I think we're going to do all right with all of the men we've got, with all of the kings we've got. And we've got a little nation of Israel who thinks they're going to fight us. Yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm.
We've been doing study on the archaeology,
Mm-hmm.
and it's pretty big. The battlefields are big.
Mm-hmm.
The valleys are big.
Yep.
It's just they travel.
Oh, yes. Mountains you got to go through and around and...
Yeah. So it's, the food, they have to...
Oh, yes.
And they have to, a lot of, and you're taking 5 years of that?
That's a long time. That's a lot of resources. Yep.
Were the Gibeonites fighting with Israel?
No, this is the people that had, nobody made peace with them, and the Gibeonites may have went in battle with them. Israel had went in with battle for the Gibeonites, and we talked about when in chapter 10 and previously, so there's a very possibility that they could have been. But it says the people of Israel could have been in there. But those people that God said, you're going to win, they went to war, and they won. So the Lord had devoted them to destruction, that they might receive no mercy, that he might destroy them just as the Lord had commanded Moses. Just as the Lord had commanded Moses. His commands that he gave to different people, his promises down through people. Moses lived a long time, and those promises, it wasn't, well, it was those group of people, but I made a promise, but we got a little far away from that. You probably don't even remember my promise, so it's not that big a deal anyway. When God makes a promise, what does He do? He keeps it. He's a man of... Yes, ma'am.
Okay, I was in here earlier, but when you're teaching people that don't know, the question I get asked is, why did God want to destroy all these things? Because they were evil.
What kind of people were these?
So that's kind of harsh.
Yes.
Killing man, woman, child,
Yep.
all that.
Everything that breathed.
And why would they want to kill the children?
Mhm.
And I was like, oh, they were evil and wicked, and they didn't want that to be carried on.
Yep. Get it from the parents. That's the way they were raised. Even though we spared the children, but this is our family's history of worshiping false gods and doing all these things they're not supposed to. So we're going to kick that back up again, and then that could infect the people of Israel. God knew that if you take 90% of your medicine your doctor prescribes for you've got an illness or an infection, what happens to that 10%? Is it still there? It doesn't get rid of it because you've only taken 90% of it. And what happens if you leave just a little bit of a disease or an infection? Does it say, okay, I'm fine with my little corner over here and I'm just going to live my happy little life? It spreads. It infects anything that touches it and it keeps growing. So God knew if you're going to be a pure people and we're going to have a pure and holy nation, you've got to get the infection out completely, 100%. Anything that they were used to and they had done before, get rid of it. Do you have something, Dan?
Well, and also we got to remember, people back then, whatever their father did,
Yep.
they did. And so it would be an automatic thing to
Yep.
revert back to whatever they were taught. That was the problem the Jews had in the New Testament when Christ came.
Yep. What's that saying about bad company corrupts good morals? If they were the Israelites, well, they're not that bad. They didn't mean it. They were children. They didn't know. But then them children started worshiping false gods. And then the Israelites were getting intertangled with those people in the land. And, well, they do it, and nothing's happening to them. So maybe we'll just do a little bit to kind of get along with them and make them feel more at home. And we start kind of looking like them and sharing some of their practices so they feel more comfortable as our... And then where does it end up? Yes, sir.
And another reason they had the conquest, God had to establish His people to make the way for Jesus who would eventually.
Exactly. You've got years and years worth of planning that God is seeing, here's where all this is going to happen, here's where Jesus is going to come through, here's the people I'm going to set up. But people, I am very guilty of this. I've got about this much vision when I'm looking at plans and, okay, I've got this much timeline, this is my life, this is what I'm going to accomplish. These weren't even the same people that these promises have been made to. These weren't even in the same timeline if you want to just look at it from a person's perspective. We don't have God's perspective because He can see the beginning and these people right now and the end. He's got a purpose. And exactly. Sometimes it gets hard to understand why would God devote these people to destruction, or even all of them, or it doesn't make sense to us because we can't see the full picture. We didn't know the hearts of those people and what they would come to do if they were left. We didn't know that they could have been 110% devoted to pagan idolatry and to bad things, and they would have never turned to God. Does God know if they would have ever turned to Him? I'd argue that God knows that. God knew if I left those people, what would they do? Because He can see beyond to what they would have become. Would have corrupted them. So now you've got a corrupt people that I've allowed to go on that are now corrupting God's people. God knows, and God's a just God, but sometimes it's kind of hard for us to get our minds wrapped around that. But when you step back and think, why would God do this? And you start to get into look of, and they were wicked and they had all of these bad things and they were going to corrupt good people and draw them away, and then it starts to kind of make sense. I understand why God was trying to get rid of all of that bad in the land. So they were devoted to destruction. They were to have no mercy, and they might destroy them just as the Lord had commanded. So we're going to get into some interesting things in verse 21. Then Joshua came at that time, and he cut off the Anakim. So who were the Anakim? They were the sons of Anak. They were giants. These were the giants, the Anakim. So if you want to flip back we'll go back to Genesis 6, verses 1 through 4. There's going to be a few verses we go through, but this is going to be the first one we'll come to. So this is the corruption of mankind back in Genesis. And it says, "Now when it came about, when men began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives for them whomever they chose. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not strive with man forever, because he also is flesh. Nevertheless, his days shall be 120 years. And the Nephilim," those were the giants, "which were on earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, they bore to them children. Those were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown." So we're going to jump over real quick to Numbers chapter 13, verse 33. So in Joshua, these people, they're called the Anakim. So you've got 13 verses 33. "Now we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, that are a part of the Nephilim, and we became like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their sight." So this is when Caleb and the spies were going into the land. They saw these giant people. And as we can see, they tied together. The sons of Anak were the Nephilim, and the Nephilim were these mighty men of renown, these men of old. And let's see. "And they were in the hill country from Hebron to Debir, and from Anab, and all the country of Judah, from all the hill country of Israel. And Joshua devoted them to destruction with their cities." What do you think the people were thinking when, okay, we've fought men that look like us, that fight like us, and we've won. And then you go into this group of people, probably a pretty good-sized group of people, and you look and they don't look like us. They're not just regular people. So, let's see. Deuteronomy chapter 9, verses 2 through 4. We'll start in verse 1. "Hear, O Israel, you are crossing over the Jordan today and going in to dispossess the nations greater and mightier than you, great cities fortified to heaven. And there's a great people, great and tall, the sons of the Anakim, whom you know and of whom you've heard it said, who can stand before the sons of Anak?" That's what they've heard about these people. Whom you've heard about. Who can stand before these great and mighty men? Well, as we look today, who can stand before the sons of Anak? The sons of God. How much mightier is God than, even then, large and somewhat seeming to have a supernatural kind of interesting past? What does that measure up when you stand them next to God? I'd say they come in pretty short. For a tall people, when stood next to God, they were pretty short. They were the sons of Anak. So, they got rid of these people, the regular people and the soldiers and the armies, and then they went to war. And I would almost see myself as a soldier. Okay, now Joshua's telling me to go fight these giants.
I think it's important to note that they were said to be 9 feet and 9 inches?
Mhm.
Is that how much they were?
Yep.
So they were really, really tall people, so that's kind of scary.
So what happened when God's people went against the Anakim? Verse 22. How many were left? Only in Gaza and Gath and Ashdod. But there was no Anakim left in the land of the sons of Israel. Did it say they struggled a long time and the Anakim seemed like they were going to prevail? And it says they destroyed them just like the rest. So these places, only in Gaza and Gath and Ashdod, that place Gath, where have we, or if you can just think off the top of your head, where have you read that before? It's where Goliath came from. 1 Samuel 17, if we want to flip over there, verse 4. And this is just another interesting thing to me is some people see the Bible as a bunch of random stories and accounts mashed together by random people, but you get to watch these threads that are woven all throughout Scripture, something that you may have read here and books later. Wait a minute. I've heard of that place before. Where David slayed the giant. So this was where Goliath lived, and we'll read 17 verse 4. Then a champion came about from the Amorites of the Philistines named Goliath from Gath, this place that we're talking about, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. And like Savannah said, brought up earlier, they have estimated that this was about 9 foot, 9 inches tall. I don't know about you, but I'm about 6'2", and generally I'm seen as a tall person. Can you imagine another almost 4 foot on top of that? Ducking when they come through the main doorway of the church? Giant men. So if you're an Israelite soldier and you're going into battle and you're thinking, oh, this will be another army, and out steps a 9 foot, 9 inch tall man in armor and swords, and he's here to fight. I could almost see there being just a little bit of doubt brought up in their mind. But Joshua devoted them to destruction with their cities. So Joshua took just a little bit of the land. Is that what the text says? The whole land. According to what? All that the Lord had spoken to Moses and to Joshua, and he gave it for an inheritance to Israel according to their divisions by their tribes. Thus the land was quiet from war. What is a life of total obedience when we do it God's way? As we can see in chapter 23, what does it ultimately end up leading to? Victory, rest, peace. If we do it man's way, these kings, their response was, let's go to war, let's battle, let's fight it out, let's do it like men do it. But when we obey the will of God, the ultimate end result, thus the land was quiet from war. The outcome of this battle, once again, like we talked about, it makes no sense to human wisdom. How could a little people take on armies with artillery and our modern day tanks, and now they've defeated giants? That makes no sense. There's something different about these people. Because if it was just military strategy, I'd say the giants would have the upper hand. I'd say these armies with these chariots would have had the upper hand, and just man's wisdom, they should have went in and cleaned house. But they didn't. Why? What did they have that those people didn't? The Lord. What did they put their stock in? They put their hope in. Military, massive numbers, all the things that to a regular person, that seems logical. If you're going to have a war, we're not going to get a little group of people and this is our army. We've got no military strategy. We've got no military technology. It doesn't make sense from human wisdom. To human wisdom, we're going to build up our armies and we're going to make coalitions and we're going to go in and we're going to show them just what the power of man can do. And they went up against the power of God, and how much did that do for them? Absolutely nothing. So I could almost see in the evil in movies when they come walking out, and you can see in even some of the cartoons, the odds just don't look in favor for the good guy. Hardly ever. We always root for the underdog. And in those movies, most of the time, what happens? Somehow finds a way. These people found a way. And what was their way? Total obedience, which led to total victory. If they would have just gave partial obedience, do you think the story would have turned out the same? Nope. They would have gave 95%. I'd say that's pretty generous. 95% obedience to what God had commanded. It wouldn't have turned out the same way. But as we can see, just as back in verse 6 and verse 7, God told Joshua, the Lord told Joshua, don't be afraid, I'll deliver them over you slain. Here's what you to do. Joshua did. So Joshua. It doesn't ever say that Joshua's like, okay, now give me a vision of the future so I can know that this is going to turn out the way you promised, or give me the step-by-step guide of what's going to happen so I can watch it play out, and then I'll have faith in you, God. How many times has God given you a reason to doubt Him? He ain't given me any. Not one. He hadn't given Joshua one. When God said something, He promised. When God said, so Joshua. So, reading Scripture, it's always good, and we can't always put ourselves in the exact shoes of these people, but we always need to, even though it was a times past and God gave them commands and told them how to act, we need to kind of draw of, how does this apply to me? Because if you can never draw application, then it's just a book. How does a book change your life if it doesn't apply to you at all whatsoever? Zero. It doesn't. But who are the spiritual people the spiritual children of Israel, the seed of Abraham today. We are. They were the people of God. We're the people of God. They were commanded to have total 100% obedience. The command for us is exactly the same. Obedience leads to total victory. Obedience leads to peace in the end. And it may not be on our timeline. Yes, sir.
And that story also shows that the people weren't in control.
Yep.
God was.
Yep.
That's a theme of the Old Testament.
Absolutely.
If they're obedient, they can
If they're obedient, they...
benefit from God's control.
Absolutely. The command is no different from us. Total obedience leads to total victory. Not partial, not just a little bit, not most of it, but total obedience. The command is still the same. And in the end, once again, it may not be on our timeline. It might not be in this life. It might not be where we can even see it. But God keeps His promises. And take comfort in that. And the land was quiet from war, and thus ended that conquest. Appreciate you all for listening today, and has enjoyed studying with you guys, and I hope you got something from this text, and just encourage you to go back through and read a little bit of Joshua, because it's an interesting book, and I appreciate you guys listening this morning.